Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. If you're looking to create a differentiated user onboarding experience for the clients that you manage, also decreasing the technician time it takes to fulfill these tickets, stay tuned because in this episode, I'm going to be showing you a solution that I built that leverages Microsoft Forms and Power Automate so that you can create a tailored onboarding experience for each client that you can actually automate a majority of the tasks for that integrates directly into your PSA tool. So these will be some of the more manual repetitive tasks that we have to do upon every user onboarding, like creating the user in Microsoft, licensing them, adding them to the groups they need to be part of, as well as some more advanced functionality like being able to mirror the group and access controls of a user specified in that form so you can provide access into different file repositories, Teams channels, SharePoint sites, everything like that as well too. So stay tuned, a lot of cool automation I'm gonna be showing you. At the end of the video, I'm also gonna be providing a link here that you can leverage for this automation template so you can begin to scale it out to your customers today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Nick. I'm a two-time Microsoft MVP and I've been creating content here in the channel for the better half of a decade. For those of you that wanna see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space and haven't subscribed yet, click on that subscribe button below. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in.
Okay, so getting into it here, I'm going to show you more of a visual diagram of what we're going to be building here between Microsoft Forms and Power Automate. We're simply going to be creating a form. I'm going to show you how to do this. This is going to be in a per tenant basis, because most of the time we have some customized workflows that relate to the onboarding SOP for each customer. So we're going to create a form and I'll show you how to do that. The workflow automation, though, in Power Automate is going to take in the form field responses and it's going to start to generate and create this activity that we see below. First thing it's going to do is going to go ahead and create the user. And when we do that, as you might know already from creating a user in Microsoft, you have to designate a password. The password considerations I'll be getting into as well. There's a couple different options and I really like to do this in the most secure fashion, but effectively here, after we create the user, we're going to assign them the manager that was designated. We're going to add a license to the user, and then we're going to send an email either to the manager or the HR representative or both that does include the action that was performed and the user's credentials as well. From there, we're going to update the user with things like their job title, their department, their mobile number, location. And then we're going to fork off into some group membership concepts, one of which is mirroring the access of another user. So basically in the form, we can say, hey, I want this user to look like Jim, because maybe Jim's in the same department, or maybe he has the same access to the certain business systems. So we're going to loop across Microsoft 365 groups, security groups, and distribution list to add the user to those groups. Otherwise, we could specify groups that the user would be added to, which would include maybe some Teams channels or some SharePoint sites for document repository access. And then we're going to provide business system access, and this could be your third-party tools like Salesforce or QuickBooks I use as examples here. And effectively, we'd love to add them as part of group memberships if they're set up as an enterprise application within our Entra environment. But if they're not, maybe we send an email to the business system owner so that they can manually go through that process. We can give them the details of that new user on board. After all this is done, we're going to create a ticket in PSA. Today, I'm going to show you how to do this with an email connector. You could get to the extent where you integrated actually into the API layer of these tools and did a little bit more like ticket classification and things like that. But for simplicity's sake, the template I'm going to provide, it's got an email connector. This is going to include the ticket detail information about what we automated, and then maybe some additional information about what hasn't been done yet, so the technician can quickly pick that up and fulfill the rest of the case there. From there, we're going to delay the workflow until the user's start date, which we're going to put into the form as far as when you fill that out. And then we're going to send both a welcome email to their personal address on file, and then we're also going to send a welcome email to the work profile, which is going to include a link and some instructions for them to go ahead and set up Microsoft Authenticator with a nice little user tutorial video. So a lot going on in here, but effectively this is a lot of the manual steps that we perform today that might create, an hour's worth at least of work for the technicians, and getting that back, depending on the client too, we might have a lot of churn or they might be significantly growing. So that means a lot both to you and to them. It's a win-win because we save a lot of time we have consistent processes, and for the customer, they get their users spun up in a consistent fashion as well. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the prerequisites that you'll want to set up prior to setting up this workflow for best practice.
Real quick guys, a short break for our sponsor CloudCapsule here, which is an application that I've built to help you monitor your security within your Microsoft 365 tenant that is mapped to the CIS controls. This is something that you could leverage to perform security audits across your customers or your individual Microsoft 365 tenants, map it to CIS, and begin to have steps in mind to go perform a compliance uplift within these customer environments, as well as derive certain project revenue from them as well too. So if you haven't already, definitely check it out. Go to cloudcapsule.io and run a free assessment today to see what it's all about.
So as it relates to best practice, really we're going to create a form and we're going to create a Power Automate flow. And I do recommend that you create that under a service account, not an active user, just because if that user ever leaves the organization, the flow or the form will break, and you do not want that to happen. So effectively, I like to keep it under a service account. You will need that service account license to Microsoft Forms, which comes part of a basic license like, Business Basic or Business Standard. And I think it's worth it to be able to apply that to them. You could, again, use a regular user for the form and maybe a service account for the Power Automate flow, because that is something that you can set up there. But I would recommend at least licensing the user for the form and for the Power Automate flow. The second thing that we're doing here is we're sending these emails out, right, from an automated fashion. And you got to think about where you're sending them from. So my recommendation is to create a shared mailbox, and we'll be showing you this in the Power Automate flow. But I would create a shared mailbox, like something like employee lifecycle at yourdomain.com, or something like no reply, so that is coming from a system generated email, not tied to an individual user. You could make it that way if you're a smaller organization, but I think it's just best practice to have that in mind. And then lastly here, for the group memberships and everything that you're doing, I always try to make Entra really clean first before looking at these workflows, meaning you want to try to leverage dynamic groups. You want to try to leverage SSO with your third-party business applications and group membership that's dynamic again, that applies to them, so that you can reduce the amount of steps that you have to take here. If we have a dynamic group that automatically adds users to SharePoint sites and Teams channels based off their job title or department, that's a lot less steps than you would manually adding every single group or manually adding the user, I should say, to every single group that needs access into those particular channels, and having that as like a drop down that you constantly have to update as part of a form. So it's really good to have basic hygiene in place for your group memberships first before kind of going down this path. And then finally, one last thing here, you notice I have these locks across the emails. And that's simply because I'm going to be applying an encryption template to the email so that it's encrypted, because we are transmitting the user password over email in those ways. And to do that, you need to set up a sensitivity label. I'll create some links as a byproduct of this to send that out. But from a password perspective, you really have the option to encrypt the email. You could use a third-party service, which I'll link in my blog, that could get you a secure link instead of putting the password into the email for the user. Or you could do something neat like integrate to Twilio if you have a Twilio account, to send the user a SMS text with the mobile number that they input into the form, versus doing this via just the plain text into the email there. I always, at least at a minimum, like to encrypt that so you have that securely attached there. You could go other methods there, but that's the way that I'm performing this in this automation flow. Now that we have some of the prerequisites down, let's start to walk through the form creation in Microsoft Forms. So if you go to forms.microsoft.com, you can click on new form. And I have Copilot, so it's asking me to draft a Copilot, but you could simply call this employee onboarding and then, insert company name, right? So I'm going to call this T-365. You can add, the company's logo and background in here if you have correctly formatted images. It's nice just because it's a little bit more tailored to their experience. I'm not going to walk through that because it's a nice to have. But this is where we can start to add any type of form fields and things like that. So generally speaking, you'll start to add things like user's full name, and you'll make this a required answer. And then, we'll add another text block. We'll say desired email address. You make this required as well. And then under the restrictions, you'll make this restriction an email so that you get this correctly formatted. Another text box, users manager. And again, we'll add the email restriction here for this. And then we'll add a date field, and we'll say anticipated start date. And then we'll add another text field here. Here we'll add job title. Make this required as well. And the next one here, we're going to add a choice field, and we're going to say this is the department. Ideally, you don't let these stay in the sense of, just whatever they want as an other option. I do not like to do that because that makes our Active Directory really cluttered. So I like to keep this to a fixed list. Something like an accountant. We can use business systems manager, and then something like software developer. Just an example. The other thing I like to do here is make this a drop down so that it's not just a bunch of fields, and you do not allow for multiple answers because you only want them to select one, obviously, with this one. And then from there, you could do other things, right? Like we could add a location that they would want to be at. We could add, in here where I would want to add the mobile number. And then I always like to put in this format here so that the user puts in the correct format that I want in my Active Directory. You could do some regex in Power Automate to validate this format, which I'm not really going to be showing you, but I'm just going to show you that's an option. And then from there, we can add our mirror the access of another user. And we can make this, a email as well too that we'll get to look up. And we can make this not required. So if they don't put that in there, we don't have to look that up, but they could as an optional field. We could also add, choice fields for team channels that they want to be part of, or groups, or SharePoint sites that they need access to. And with those, you would make them multi-select so that you can select multiple answers that we would loop through and pull in. I'm not going to show that as part of this example. I prefer to use the mirror the access of and dynamic groups to really dictate the group access within the user on board. But the other thing that you could do within here is list out your hardware requirements. And then, this could include things like, their actual laptop. It could include the peripherals. And you could include another option here so that they could add, free-form text if it's applicable. And then you could also do things like adding a choice here for business system access. And then you could put in things like Salesforce. I would make this a fixed list as well, just to not have another option, because we really want to have a defined workflow for that. You could if you wanted to, just so it goes into the ticket that we're going to be creating. But anything else that you want to add as a required field, you could within here as well to our input. And then generally speaking, I like to add kind of a textual field that might be as a long response, which is there anything else we should know about this user? Just so they have an option to add more details, as a blanket level bucket, if you will, for getting that access. So this is kind of how I generally like to lay this out. Again, you could add specifics for certain access across teams, SharePoint, whatnot. Generally, again, you try to mirror that with the group access already. But then the biggest thing that you're doing here is that you really want to gate this down. You don't want to just have this as a free form bucket that anybody in the world specifically could access, but also you only want specific people within the corporation to be able to add, or submit requests via this form. And generally speaking, that's going to be your HR department. So you want to have specific people in T-365 can respond. And then we're going to have, the record of their name and all of that. For the sake of this demo, I'm just going to do it with anyone so I can just show you guys this, but I'm going to recommend that you do specific people. So I'm going to copy this link here. And this is what's going to be the front end, to our user experience. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and pivot into the Power Automate workflow so I can show you that as well. Okay, so I'm here within Power Automate. I'm going to go to My Flows, and you're going to create a new flow, and you're going to automate CloudFlow here. And I'm going to call this Employee Onboard. And the trigger is actually, for me, up at the top, but you can search for it. It's when a new response is submitted from a Microsoft form. I'm going to click on Create. And I'm going to give you guys this as a template, so you can choose to follow along, but I'm also going to be providing this to you so you can just upload it into your customer tenants to be able to work from. But really what we're going to do here is we're going to click on the drop down from the form ID, and we're going to select our employee onboarding form. We're going to add an action here. We're going to search for forms, and then we're going to click on get response details. We're also going to select the employee onboarding form here for the form ID, and the response ID we're dynamically grabbing from the previous action. And so we're going to click the response ID here, and then we're going to do a few things here which is related to kind of that password generation. So we really want to establish a new variable. So we're going to look at variables, and we're going to say we're going to initialize a variable. We're going to rename this to generate password. And then we're going to call this password. This is going to be a string value. And then for the value name, this is where we get into some of the expressions here. And so you really want to do, like in this case, we're going to do a rand value, which is going to generate a random number. And we're going to do this with the 10,000 and then all the way up to 99,999. We're going to add that in there. I usually like to add a little prefix in there as well too. So that looks good there. And I would recommend, as you're walking through this, if you're doing it ad hoc versus using my template, to just save it periodically. This is just a thing I've learned over the past. If you don't, you pivot off the page, or you go away for a while and come back and you refresh the page, everything's gone. So not a fun time with that. Next thing that we're doing here is we're going to set the mail nickname, because we're going to need this for the user creation. And you would have learned this, I know it because I've walked all the way through this, but you would have learned it when you try to create a user. It's going to ask for this mail nickname, and that's not necessarily something we specified in the form, and not something that the user would generally know. So I like to mask it. And so within here, we're going to rename this to set mail nickname. We're going to call it mail nickname. It's going to be a string. And here, we're also going to use an expression. Basically, this is a split statement to try to grab, and the mail nickname is really just, that prefix of the UPN, if you will, for the mail nickname. So in the body here, we are then going to grab some of the dynamic content, and we're going to say the desired user address here. We've got two bodies, so I'm going to clean that up. And we're going to click on add. So now that we've got that in there, again, recommend saving periodically here too. Next thing that we're doing here is we're setting up an array for distribution groups. So in a future video, I'm going to show you how to leverage Azure automations to sync into PowerShell. And you can actually automate this step as well too. But here in this video, I'm going to just show you that for the distribution groups, we can't add those over an API within Power Automate. And so I effectively am creating a blank array that we'll be able to add them into so that we can put this into the ticket for the technician to do. But in the future, again, I will show you how to basically automate this step as well. It's a bummer, just the way that Microsoft's kind of created groups over time, right? So the next thing that we're going to do is we're adding action. This is where we get into the Entra endpoint. We have a Microsoft Entra ID. It will ask you to create a connection, and you can use the service account. Technically, what we're doing here, that service account would need some role-based permissions to say that they can create users, they can update users, and they can create or add to groups. So they have to have read and write capabilities for users and groups. A least privilege model would be user administrator and group administrator for the service account to have, and the RBAC roles, just as a call out there as well. But within here, we're going to get the manager of a user. And so with that, we're going to say get user. And in here, we're going to specify the dynamic output of the user's manager. And then from here, we're going to go back into Entra, and we're going to click on create user. Account enabled is yes. Display name is going to be user's full name. Mail nickname is our variable. Password is our password. User principal name is desired email address. And you could fill out a user's surname and give a name if you wanted to. But that's all we're going to do in this step. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to assign the manager. So we're going to go back to Entra. We're going to click on assign manager here. And we're going to get the user ID of the manager, which is going to be this dynamic field for get manager. And then the user ID is going to be the user we just created. So that's one of the assignments we can do here. The next step, we're going to add a parallel branch because this speeds up just the time it takes. We're going to add another Entra action. We're going to say, this is the assign license functionality. So this is another prerequisite I probably should have called out. But essentially here, what we're doing is we're saying that we want to go ahead and add a user to a group that automatically is assigning license within our tenant. You could, again, do a little bit more advanced functionality, tap into PowerShell or Graph API, and just assign the license without them having to be part of a group. Unfortunately, I don't have a connector or an action associated to that specifically. So what we're doing is we're just assigning them to a group that has the license assigned itself. So let me pivot into Entra so you can see what I'm talking about there. All right, so within my Entra here, you can go to all groups, and I think I already created one in here for this example. We got license administrator. Actually, I don't think I've created one. Let's just do that. I'm going to create it as a security group. I'm going to call it Microsoft 365 Business Premium Users. And then the membership type is assigned. We're not going to put any members in there right now. And then from here, we've got BP users. All that you would do is under the licenses section here, you would click on assignments, and I would select Business Premium as this assignment. You could select all the service plans if you didn't want them to have some of these as well, and you would click on save there. I'm not going to do it for the sake of this demo, but effectively that's all you're doing. I recognize that this would break down if you lost or were not having enough licenses. So that's another, value add you could try to build on top of this. If you were out of licenses, you could also integrate with like a Pax8 API to do that. A little bit beyond the functionality I wanted to show today though, but you just got to call that out as far as the assignment goes. So the object ID is what you're copying here, and then we're going to add it into our workflow here. And this is just going to be hard coded within the workflow. From there, we're going to add another parallel branch, and we're going to search for send email. And this is where we're sending it from a shared mailbox. I talked about this in the prerequisites. You want to have that come from like employee lifecycle at domain.com, no reply at domain.com. But effectively, I'm just going to hard code this to other shared mailbox user. In the two, we're going to switch to advanced mode, and we're going to click on this to go ahead and send it to the manager. You could also specify the HR provider as well too there, or HR contact. And you might want to say like you've been assigned the manager for a new user or something like that. And then I'm just going to copy this over again. This will be in the template that I do provide you. I like to use either GPT or Copilot to measure, kind of or actually create the template, I should say, so it's nicely formatted. But within here, you're basically putting in the dynamic outputs. So we're getting the manager display name, the new user, and then you're getting the create user object for the display name. So you're just basically dynamically populating this. And this is also where, again, if you have sensitivity labels that imply encryption, you're going ahead and just saying that this is restricted, in some way. And I like to put in HR content that'll encrypt this email that goes out. And I just want to rename this here to manager HR. So you can perform all those actions, at once here. And then typically this takes some time to provision the user. And generally speaking, I haven't had too big of problems with this, but every once in a while, the API takes a little bit longer. So we want to put in a delay here before we update further. And you can search for the delay. You can find it here under schedule. And then under the settings here, I want to go ahead and add these other actions so that it does not go until those other ones are performed, basically is what I'm defining there. And then the count, I'm going to say this is just 30 seconds that we're waiting and pausing for the action of all this to complete. And then we're going to go back to Entra here. We're going to click on See More. And we're going to update a user. User ID, grabbing from Create User. And we're not updating any of this stuff because we already set that. But we are going to generate job title, department, mobile number. You could do office location if you had that. And then we're going to dynamically specify all of this that came from the form. Nope, not department again. All right, and again, you could add and chain different events on here. The other one I like to do dynamically is I like to add additional properties. And then here you can specify one, which is the employee hire date. And I like to add that as an attribute within Entra. You put in the anticipated start date here as well. And then the next thing that we're going to do, I'm going to show you, is just getting the mirror groups of users. So technically, if you wanted to, you could grab, the groups that they put in as far as, what groups that they want to be or have access to. But more so, I want to show you just getting the mirrored users or getting the groups of a mirrored user. So within here, you can say get groups of a user. And I'm going to just change this. And I'm going to specify and then security enabled only, we're going to say no because we want to get all groups. But that would allow you to kind of overcome what we're going to see next here, which is you kind of have to loop through the groups here, to see the distribution, right? Like as in the different types of groups, and depending on the groups that come back, we may want to take a particular action. A good example of this is if they're in a dynamic group, we don't want to add the user there. We won't be able to actually because it's not part of the syntax. So we'd want to skip over that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a condition. So the first thing that we want to say here is, did any groups return? And basically what we're going to define there is we are asking in this expression here, we're going to create a general expression. We're going to say the length. And then it wants to create this. And so we're going to say, was there anything within this body? Did we get any groups back, basically? And we're going to say if it's greater than 0, because we're saying at least one group returned, right, from this particular statement. If it doesn't, we're not going to do anything. But if it does, then we're going to do another action, which is apply to each. And the apply to each here, we're basically saying we're going to loop through the groups. And we're going to get the body value of the mirrored groups here. And then the next action we're going to take is we're going to use the entre action again here. And we're going to get the group. So for this group ID, we're going to use the current item, which is basically going to get the ID of the group that we're looping through at this particular moment in time. And then this is where it kind of gets a little bit more complicated because we're starting to nest workflows based off the group type. So again, we're going to look for a conditional statement here. And within here, we're basically saying that we want to go ahead and grab the output from this and look for group type. Because effectively here, we're saying that we want to go ahead and look for dynamic membership. And so we're using an expression here. We're saying outputs of get group, and then nested in that, the body of it, I'm looking for group types. And then we're going to ask if it contains, and then this is a value. And you learn this, I learned this, basically from going through and effectively saying, what is the API output that we get, right? I had to learn that over time. And so we're going to call this action here, check for dynamic group. So if it's not, or if it is a dynamic group, we're not going to do anything because we don't want to touch those. Those are dynamic in nature. And then what we want to do is we also want to check for distribution groups. So we're going to add another action here, another conditional statement. So we're going to check for a distribution group here. We're going to add a couple of expressions here. The first is just saying, is the length of the body of the group type equal to 0? Because that generally has that in there. And then we're going to add a new item here. We're going to add a row, and we're going to make this an and statement so that both have to fulfill basically as this, because the other thing that we have within here is this security enabled. So we're basically saying is the output of the get group include security enabled or equal to this or equal to false, really I should say. And if these things are true here, if a combination of them is true, it's really a distribution group. So effectively here, if we're checking for that distribution group, if it's true, what we're going to go ahead and say here is that we're going to append to that variable we created earlier. And again, this is where I can show you later on how you could automate this with PowerShell. But basically, we're going to append to an array variable, and we're going to use our distribution groups here. And the array variable that we're going to put in here, the value for this is going to be the display name. So we're just getting the output there. So we're adding there. And then what we want to do here, is basically just make sure that this isn't going to fail. We're going to add them to whether this is a security group, it's an M365 group. We're going to go ahead and use the entre value again here to say get group members. And the group ID is going to be here the current item that we're looping through again. So again, this value. And then we're going to use a new action you haven't seen yet, which is a filtering action. We're going to filter the array that comes back here. And we're going to be looking for the group members output. and then we're going to be filtering on in here a dynamic value of the user principal name. So we're looking for this group member, which is the item here. User principal name is equal to, and then we're going to look for our create user object. And we're going to say the user principal name of this. So basically saying, is this person that we created already within this group for some reason? Did we add them in there? So next here, we're going to add an action for a conditional statement. And we're basically going to say, in here, we're going to use another expression. And we're going to say that the length of this particular filter array, and we're going to call this see if user not in group. And if we're saying that this is equal to 0, if that's true, if it's false, if it has something in there, it means they're already part of that group, so we don't want to do anything. But if they are, we're going to use the onTrue function again to add the user to the group. And the user ID is the create user dynamic value, and the group ID is again the current item. So a decent amount of steps here, but effectively here, we're getting the user, we're looping through the groups, we're checking if it's dynamic, we're checking if it's a distribution group, and then we're looking to see if they're already added. If they're not, we're going to go ahead and add them into that group. So pretty detailed there, a lot of nesting, but I hope that gives you some skills too, just for overall Power Automate workflows. So the next thing that we're going to do is create kind of a switch statement to apply actions to any business systems access. So one of the things that we want to do here is we want to go ahead and compose or create the compose action here, which effectively, this allows you to manipulate different inputs and convert them into different objects. So what we want to say here is we're basically saying that we want to get the business applications, and we're going to convert them into a JSON object so we can loop over them and apply certain actions. So within here, we're going to create a function, and we're going to go ahead and say, give me the JSON body of, or convert this body into JSON, really. And we're going to say business systems access, and that's going to dynamically put that in there. And so the next thing that we want to do is we are going to add an action here, and we're going to loop over each of those. So we're going to say apply to each. Say loop over business systems, and we're going to take the business apps output from this so that we can kind of loop through. And within here, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a switch statement. And the switch basically is saying, we're going to look at each value that's coming across, and we're going to look for loop over business systems and look at the current item. We have a default value that could be applied. I don't want to set that because I want this to be specific. You could add one if you wanted to, but we're saying if it equals, now remember on our form, we put in things like Salesforce and QuickBooks. So we're going to have a case here. I'm going to call this Salesforce. And basically you're adding actions depending on that switch statement. So if they include Salesforce in this loop, then we can do things like, again, add the user to a group if they're not already being done in prior steps, or we could send an email for business systems access to the individual who manages that. And I'm not going to take those steps because I don't have any specifics to show you in that regard, but you're basically just creating a switch for every one of those form use cases. So recall here on the form business systems access, again, this could be a very verbose long list that you go through. And I'm going to copy QuickBooks Online too. And then within here, case 2, I'm going to rename to QuickBooks Online. So right, this is where you can just loop over and create specific actions for your business systems, and you could have a default switch depending on maybe if they hit other, right, or something like that if you did include that option. You can just pump in that value as part of that. So the next thing that we're going to do here is we are going to go ahead and add an action. And this action, we're going to go ahead and say is our ticket generator. I'm going to specify the mailbox. And then I'm going to say create a ticket. And this is again where you can get this from the template or whatnot, but I'm going to go ahead and paste this in here. And effectively, all you're doing is putting in dynamic values, and you're saying, you could put in maybe the company name. If you're working as an MSP dash, probably more something like new user creation dash insert company name dash, and then put in the dynamic value of the user or their UPN or something like that. And this could be your support at t-365.com, which would create the ticket and PSA. And then you just be dynamically populating these values, right? So within here, you could say the name, the email, and so forth. And basically just grabbing, anything like that, including some of the things that you didn't automate, like, is there anything else we need to know about this user, right? And that's just a bad example given we have all that in there, but you can really make this dynamic, right? As far as anything that you would need to put into there to give the user the context in the ticket as part of that. So that's all what you would do to create the ticket. And then again, we're going to put a delay in here until the user start date. And with this one, this is just another one that I've learned over time. You can go ahead and add a timestamp, and we're going to put a expression in here, and we're going to convert to UTC, and then we're going to use the dynamic content of the anticipated start date, and then we're going to do a comma value. And you'll notice in here they give you a little link here you can grab, which is the time zone that you're going to be in. So now here we can go in and we can grab the time zone that we are in completely. And for me, I'm just going to search for Mountain Time. Mountain Standard Time is what we want there. So back in our Power Automate flow, we'll put this in single quotes for Mountain Standard Time as part of that expression. Make sure you have any trailing spaces you remove. And so that's going to wait until that user start date, and then we can go ahead and send a couple of more emails here. And one thing I didn't put in the form that you would want to put in here is the user's personal email address if you're taking that in to send them their password upon the first day. So just take that in mind, and you'd put that into the dynamic value here for what they're looking at. And within there, again, you could specify the work email in code. And this is just an HTML template that'll be part of the actual template that I send up to you. But this has the link for setting up MFA, and we could include a video tutorial for them as well too, that they get. Just say welcome email work. And again, you'll specify here, welcome to T-365, right, for my organization, and then specify the users here as well. And this would go, if you switch to it, this would go to the user's mailbox here that they would get because they're part of that new user onboard flow. And the only time you'll get a rejection email is if it hadn't had enough time to propagate. And generally speaking, you should be doing this in advance, not like within the hour that they're starting. So I wouldn't think that would break down, but that's just another call out that I wanted to put in there. So let's go ahead now that we have this. Let me go ahead and finish this up and save it. And then we're going to go ahead and test this as well. One thing I got when I try to save, just as a call out, no special characters in here. Let's just put or for that. And then we're going to save this up. All right, so to test here, we can click on test. We can say manually trigger this. It's going to wait for a response. So we're going to go ahead and fill out that form. So I'm on the form here. We're going to enter the name of the user. We're going to say Rick Ross. Desired email address. User's manager is me. Anticipated start date, we're going to say is today, just to show you this completely. Job title is going to be VP of Product. Department is going to be Software Developer. And I'm realizing now that's not a great department name, just as a call out. I'm just going to put in a fake number here. Again, if you have a Twilio integration, you could send the password to the user. We're going to mirror the access of me. We're going to specify the hardware requirements. And then we're going to say, this is another one you would want to make multi-select in there. And then we're going to say test. Then we're going to click on submit. Popping back over, this is working through, going ahead and grabbing all this information. And we got a bad request here on this. So let's go ahead and look and see what's going on. Specified password does not meet the complexity requirements. So let's go take a look at this. So within here, you do need to specify kind of like a capital letter in the statement. So just want to show you this to show you an error. You can click on save here. The cool part is I don't need to go ahead and basically resubmit the form. That's not how I would do troubleshooting with this. If you go back, you go to the failed flow here. You can simply click on resubmit, and then I'll take the same form inputs. As long as it didn't create the user and do all that, you're okay. So let's see if we can get this to pass this time. And then we've got a failed message here, which is not found. And I believe that's just because I didn't put in REST API is not supported for this mailbox. So let's take a look at it here. Let's go back. Bruce Wayne. Let's take a look at Bruce Wayne. Here in the admin portal, so I could take a look at shared mailboxes. And Bruce Wayne's not in there. So let's do support. All right, let's pivot back. Let's go ahead and change this to support. Everything still looks good there now. Let's go ahead and click on save. And we'll go back and we will click on this again. Now the problem here is that we did go ahead and create this user. So we just need to blow them away from Entra. So if I'm in Entra, I'll go to users, all users. And I'll search for Rick Ross. There he is. Cool part is you can already start to see some of our workflow running. He's been added to the license group. If I go to delete though, just so we don't have any errors happen from that. This happens instantaneously. So if we go back to the flow, click on resubmit. All right, we got more things green lighting now, which is good. Now it's going to delay for that 30 seconds. But again, if we go back to Entra, we refresh, we have Rick Ross. This is the new user we just created. And if we go into properties, we can also see manager has been defined here, Nick Ross, that was me. That was the person we specified in the form. And again, if we go to groups, we're starting to see also now the other groups that are populating from the mirrored users. So it's looping through our workflow here, getting the users that are part of these groups that we have, and there's 22 of them that it found as part of that. So this takes just a minute to go ahead and run through. But this is pretty cool because we're seeing these start to populate over here. And these are all the groups that the other user is part of. Now back in here, this finished up. It says this is an invalid template. This JSON parameter is not valid. Provide value Salesforce cannot be parsed. So this is a problem with our form in and of itself. So if we go back to the form, because we have this as single select, it doesn't come across as an array. So let's do this again. We can get multiple answers. Let's go ahead and collect responses. Copy the URL. We go back into Entra now. And we are going to delete Rick Ross one more time. And then we are going to fill out this form again. So let's say Rick Ross. Pay start date is today. Job title is VP of Product. Department. Mobile phone number. Mirror the access. Hardware requirements. Say they need access to both. And then test. Okay. Now let's go back to our Power Automate flow. Let's click back over here. This guy's running now. All right, we're looping through again, trying to get all these groups. So if we pivot back to Entra, refresh our page here, we got Rick Ross. Got our groups maybe coming through. Just got this one for now. It's still probably in that delayed phase. Go back to properties here. I didn't show this before. Job title, department came through because of that delay. Phone number as well. For the user, got the manager here. Go back to groups. Starting to see those populate. Waiting for this to complete. And then one more error here. So we got our biz apps, and we can loop over these. It's got Salesforce, QuickBooks Online that we're looping over. And we did one of two. Switch statement here. Salesforce for the first one. QuickBooks Online for the second one. We could have taken action here. We've got a similar error on the create ticket. So again, I'm going to edit this. It's because I put Bruce Wayne, I think, in here again. So these are just small things. I wanted to do this really authentically just so you can see how to troubleshoot. Again, we want to do this from support. And we'll add also some more like the hardware requirements for this, just to showcase. And we'll save. I think I have the welcome email I need to change as well, actually. I'm hard coding this to me just for the sake of this example. Let me save here. Go back to Entra. Delete this user for now. And then we'll go back here. This has been saved. So one last time, this should go through this time. Let's resubmit. So just like all things in life, this did not go through again. And we need to modify it one more time. So we got a formatting error on the Mountain Standard Time, basically, for what we were doing. So effectively here, I just had this in the wrong format. So let's take a look at why that might be. Let's go ahead and edit. And let's see what we got going on here. All right, Mountain Standard Time. Yep, we just had a space in there. So one of those things that is really aggravating most of the time, but been through this enough now. Oh, and that's another thing. Okay, you just saw there, I clicked out of it without updating, so it didn't really update. If we just double check, that looks good. Let's do this one more time. Let's save. Okay, so we've finally gotten this to go through now. We've gotten everything to be satisfied. So I've already kind of showed you the upper steps here, right, as far as that getting fulfilled. But if we go take a look at email as well, we've got both our email with the credentials. We've got our template applied for encryption here for the label that we've been assigned. And then we also, just to show you, we have this HTML template for the completing the MFA setup, which will take them through. You can put the link in here as well too, but this is just a nicely formatted email that you could send out to the user that has those instructions for their first day of work. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you guys is just how to upload the template that I'm going to provide to you in the blog post. And in here, you can click on My Flows under the Power Automate portal, click on Import and Import Package Legacy. This is where you're going to upload the zip file that I've created here as well. So we'll click on Upload. You're going to upload the zip, and it'll take just a minute here for that to generate. From here, if you have the import set up as Create as New, that's just what you're going to leave it versus Update for the purposes of the example. And then you're going to create your connections here through each of these different aspects. Remember, this might be your shared mailbox. This might be your service account, and the same thing with the Microsoft Forms collection. And you can click on the import and you can click on Create New, which will take you to the connections page where you can search for these resources and you can actually create the connection, come back here, click on refresh, and then select the connection. When you're done with that, you can simply just click on import and you'll be able to start modifying the various variables as part of that, like the form ID, the form template that you're going to be using, the actual, obviously the shared mailboxes you're going to be consuming and things of that nature. So feel free to reach out if you have any problems with that, but that's everything that I wanted to cover as far as the import goes.
Okay guys, that's everything I had for you today. Definitely comment with any questions and check out the blog posts in the description here of this video so you can get access to that Power Automate template. And stay tuned because next week, if you're a Halo PSA user, we're actually going to be going through how to use the self-service portal and the forms there to actually create this automation workflow into Power Automate and not use Microsoft Forms. So if you use Halo PSA, definitely a cool video for you to see. But as always, like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content on Microsoft and MSP space. I'll see you guys next week.